There's something enchanting about dollhouses. At least that's what I used to think. Tiny worlds contained within perfect walls, where every piece of furniture, every little figure, fits exactly where it belongs. It's like holding a story in your hands, a story you get to create. You can rearrange the rooms, change the scenes, and pretend for a moment that you're in control of something so much smaller and simpler than the real world. When I was younger, I thought dollhouses were magical. Not the kind of magic you read about in fairy tales, but the quiet, comforting kind. A world without surprises, where everything is exactly as it seems. They were safe, unchanging, predictable. Or so I believed. The truth is, magic doesn't always feel like wonder. Sometimes it feels like something else entirely. It can creep into the spaces you don't notice at first, filling the cracks with things you can't explain. It takes something innocent, something ordinary, and twists it just enough that you start to question everything you thought you knew. That's what I learned the year the dollhouse came into our lives. It wasn't mine. It belonged to my sister, though I wish now that it had never belonged to any of us. At first, it seemed like any other toy, a harmless little structure meant for play. But that house wasn't a toy. It wasn't safe. It wasn't anything I could have imagined. If I had known what it would do, I would have burned it the moment I saw it. But I didn't know. Not until it was too late. Dollhouses are supposed to be places where the world makes sense. This one wasn't. It was something else entirely. Something I still don't have words for. The dollhouse arrived on a quiet afternoon. It wasn't a gift anyone remembered asking for. It came in a plain box, taped at the edges, with no note or card attached. My sister found it first, tucked against the front steps. She was the one who dragged it inside, balancing its weight awkwardly in her small hands. I remember the first moment I saw it, resting on the living room floor, framed by sunlight spilling through the window. It was old, but its craftsmanship was undeniable. Every window, every door, and every piece of furniture seemed to belong in a world smaller and stranger than ours. Each room had a story, though none of us could say what it was. Lily's fascination began immediately. She spent hours studying its corners, her fingers tracing the delicate edges of the tiny chairs and tables. The dolls came next, wrapped in soft fabric tucked in a drawer underneath the house. There were 5 of them, each molded from porcelain with painted expressions that felt alive. It didn't seem odd at first. Children find joy in small things. She lined them up, assigning them roles only she understood. She spent evenings moving them between rooms, brushing their clothes, setting their scenes. It was harmless play. Or at least, that's what I thought then. The house began to change. At first, it was subtle. A chair moved slightly, a door left ajar when no one had touched it. Once, I noticed a tiny crack in the painted wall of a room that hadn't been there before. I thought it was just my imagination, the way details feel sharper when you start paying attention. Lily grew quiet. She carried the house into her room and rarely spoke while she played. The rest of us let her. Kids go through phases, we told ourselves. It wasn't unusual for her to lose herself in a new toy, but there was something in the way she held the dolls, in the way she arranged them. She didn't laugh. She didn't smile. It was just a dollhouse. That's what I told myself when I saw her sitting there late at night, the soft glow of her bedside lamp pooling around her as she moved the pieces. That's what I told myself when I closed my door and tried not to think about it. It wasn't long before I noticed the first parallel. The first time I made the connection, it felt like nothing more than a coincidence. Lily had placed one of the dolls on a tiny balcony that jutted from the second floor of the house. Its hand rested on the railing, and its body leaned forward, as if watching the world below. Later that day, my dad slipped near the landing at the top of the stairs. He caught himself before anything serious happened, but the similarity lingered in my mind. It was strange, but not enough to worry me. I didn't say anything. There was no reason to. It wasn't until the next incident that my unease began to grow. A week later, I noticed one of the dolls lying face down near the miniature front door. Its tiny arm stuck out at an odd angle. That afternoon, the family dog limped into the house, its paw injured. No one saw what had happened, but the placement of the doll, the way its arm bent unnaturally, stayed with me. I started paying closer attention. Lily was always playing, her focus sharper than I had ever seen before. She rearranged the dolls constantly, moving them from one room to another. The scene seemed ordinary enough with a doll seated at the dining table, another on the couch. Sometimes they gathered near the staircase or stood by the front door. At least that's what it looked like at first. One evening, I walked past her door and saw her leaning over the dollhouse. Her hands moved carefully, placing each doll in precise positions. The room was dark except for the glow of her bedside lamp. I lingered in the hallway, just watching. The scene she had arranged was familiar. It wasn't until the next morning that I realized why. The dolls were positioned in a way that mimicked our family at dinner the night before. Even the way she had placed the chairs matched perfectly. When I finally stepped into her room, the scene had changed. The dolls sat in a circle, one chair overturned. It looked deliberate. Something about the arrangement pulled at me, like it wanted me to see it for what it was, though I couldn't say what that was. Later that night, an argument broke out at dinner. My mom and dad exchanged heated words over something trivial, and as my dad stood abruptly to leave, his chair tipped backward. The sound of it hitting the floor startled everyone into silence. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. There were too many similarities. It wasn't just imagination or coincidence anymore. There was something strange about that dollhouse, and Lily was at the center of it. But she didn't seem troubled. When I asked her why she arranged the dolls the way she did, she only shrugged. Her answer was simple, almost dismissive. It's how it's supposed to be. The words clung to me, heavy and unexplained. That night, I dreamed of the house. It stood in the center of an empty room, its windows glowing faintly, though no light source was visible. When I woke up, I could still feel the weight of it, like it had followed me out of sleep. I started to wonder how much of what I was seeing was real, and how much of it was in my head. But the feeling didn't go away. It stayed with me, quietly growing, as more and more of Lily's play began to mirror life. The parallels became impossible to ignore. It wasn't just once or twice anymore. Every time Lily rearranged the dolls, something seemed to shift in our world. Small things at first, a misplaced item, a sudden change in someone's mood. But then, the events began to carry weight. One morning, I found the dollhouse on her desk. Lily had arranged the dolls around the dining table again, but this time one chair was empty. It didn't feel like a simple oversight. The space seemed intentional, as if it meant something. That night, my mom called to say she'd be working late and wouldn't be home for dinner. I stared at her empty chair across the table and thought about the dollhouse. It was starting to feel like a warning. A week later, I noticed another scene. A doll was lying near the front door, its tiny hand stretched out as if reaching for something. A small suitcase stood beside it. That afternoon, my dad announced he'd be leaving for a business trip. He stood in the exact spot where I'd seen the doll. I kept quiet, but my stomach churned. I started watching Lily more closely. She rarely spoke now, her attention completely absorbed by the dollhouse. Her hands moved with practiced precision, placing and adjusting the dolls in ways that made no sense to me. When I asked her about it, she didn't look up. She just said, "They need me to do it." Her voice was calm, detached. She didn't seem upset or even particularly aware of what she was saying. It was as though the words weren't hers at all. I couldn't stay away from the dollhouse. I told myself it was to keep an eye on Lily, to understand what was happening. But part of me was drawn to it, compelled by something I couldn't explain. The details seemed sharper now. The tiny paintings on the walls, the faint cracks in the floorboards, even the stitching on the doll clothes. It all felt alive in a way I didn't want to acknowledge. Then the accidents began. A broken arm, a twisted ankle, small injuries that didn't feel connected at first. But every time I'd see something in the dollhouse that matched. A doll with its leg bent awkwardly under a chair. Another slumped against a wall, its arm outstretched. The connections were there, and they were getting harder to dismiss. One night, I caught Lily arranging the dolls in a peculiar way. They were all in the living room, gathered around a small coffee table. One doll was standing, its arms raised, while the others seemed to be looking at it. It felt staged, like it was building toward something. When I asked her what it was, she paused for a long moment before answering. It's just how it's supposed to be. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about the way she had said it, the way her voice carried a kind of certainty I couldn't understand. It wasn't just a game to her anymore. It was something else, something deeper. I didn't know what, but I could feel it growing, pressing in on all of us. The dollhouse was no longer just a toy. It had become a blueprint, and our lives were being drawn inside it. The dollhouse consumed my thoughts. No matter how much I tried to ignore it, the feeling stayed with me. It wasn't just Lily's obsession anymore. It had become mine too. I needed to understand what was happening, to find some way to stop it. One evening, I passed by her room and noticed the door was slightly open. Inside, Lily sat cross-legged on the floor, her focus locked on the dollhouse. The scene she was arranging made me stop cold. The tiny bed in the upstairs room looked just like mine. The same navy blanket, the same worn pillow. Even the school bag slumped against the wall was there, a detail so exact it made my skin crawl. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. My eyes followed her hands as she positioned one of the dolls. It was sitting on the edge of the bed, its legs dangling. Another doll stood in the corner, facing the wall. A third lay sprawled on the floor, its arms bent unnaturally. The whole scene felt off, as though it was waiting for something to happen. Lily didn't notice me at first. When she finally glanced up, her face was pale, her eyes wide with something that looked like fear. She didn't speak, but she didn't have to. The way she looked at me said enough. It was my room she had recreated, my life she was arranging. I stepped into the room, my heart pounding. The air felt heavy, almost stifling, as if the dollhouse itself was watching me. I reached for it, my fingers trembling as they brushed against the roof. Lily's voice broke the silence. They said, "It's your turn." The words froze me. She wasn't pleading or angry. She sounded resigned, like she had given up fighting whatever was controlling her. I didn't know who they were, and I didn't want to know. Something inside me snapped. I grabbed the dollhouse and carried it out of the room, ignoring Lily's cries behind me. I didn't stop until I reached the backyard. The hammer in the shed felt cold in my hands, but I didn't hesitate. I brought it down on the dollhouse with all the strength I could muster. Wood splintered, paint chipped, and the tiny rooms caved in under the blows. I kept swinging until there was nothing left but shattered pieces scattered across the grass. When I finally stopped, the silence was deafening. The air felt lighter, but something still didn't feel right. I turned back toward the house, and that's when I heard it. A scream, sharp and piercing, coming from Lily's room. I ran upstairs, my chest tight with panic. She was lying on the floor, motionless but breathing. Her face was pale, her eyes closed. I tried shaking her awake, but she didn't respond. Her small frame looked fragile, almost doll-like. That night, I sat beside her bed, watching her as she slept. The doctor said there was nothing physically wrong with her. No injuries, no illnesses. She would wake up when she was ready, they told us. But something told me she wasn't just sleeping. She was trapped somewhere else, somewhere I couldn't reach her. The next morning, I woke up to find the dollhouse gone. Every splinter, every shard of wood had disappeared. Lily's room was empty except for her bed and the faint scent of something sweet, like old paint. I've stopped trying to explain it. Some things aren't meant to be understood. I haven't touched a doll since that day. Sometimes late at night, I think I hear the faint sound of furniture moving, but I tell myself it's just the wind. And yet, I can't shake the feeling that it isn't over. Not for me. This story couldn't have happened without the lovely supporters you see on screen. If you enjoyed it and want more creepy tales, hit that like button and subscribe to stay updated. If you'd like to support the channel and get access to exclusive content, consider joining my Patreon. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one. Stay safe and beware of the shadows.